Hey, what's up everybody? Welcome to this week's Q&A. It's Thursday night and I wanted to make sure to shoot these before I left for my trip to California tomorrow. So hopefully I'll be able to have time to get to everybody's question and hopefully none will come in afterwards. But let's jump right in. First up, Firebrand X posted in regards to Roman Munn's question from last week about having streaking and jail bars on his NES RGB installation, and Firebrand X reminded us of something I'd completely forgotten about, even though it was something that I'd talked about on the weekly roundup. A batch of NES RGB boards went out with counterfeit voltage regulators on them. So it was not Tim Worthington's fault. He ended up getting screwed over by a supplier. He posted instructions all over the place on how to fix it should you have a problem with one. So if you end up having an issue with the NES RGB, check everything that I talked about last week. Super clean installation, routing of wires, make sure the external PSU is good. You could always try replacing the capacitor in that. I prefer to use either the Triad external PSUs, the aftermarket ones that Firebrand X links to on his site, as well as the Power Plus with some adapters. I've had great luck with those as well. So anybody having issues like that, those could be fixes for it. But it looks like Roman posted later on and said that he checked all the solder points, taking great care of the C-Sync and ground lines, and it looks like now the installation is working fine. He also mentioned that I had said something about removing the RF modulator from a Model 1 Genesis, and I believe you misunderstood. It wasn't to reduce jail bars. It was very simply so that you could take a Genesis 2 style DIN connector and solder that upside down to the board in the place of the RF connector, allowing you to just skip all weird adapters and get stereo audio. And usually this is done with a triple bypass or something, so you could just have all of your great isolated signals on a Genesis 2 DIN. Didn't really have anything to do with jail bars or anything like that. So if you needed to do this, I would just go to the Genesis section of the website and go to the Genesis 1 RGB bypass, and you should have everything that you'd need. I didn't have time to do really detailed instructions, so if you've done stuff like that before, which NES RGB is pretty close, you should be able to figure it out based on the pictures, but I hope to someday go back and really do basic walkthrough step-by-step guides like I used to have time to do back when I had time. So yeah, don't worry about it to reduce jail bars. Do it to if you want to swap the DIN with a Model 2. And read up on that page, read up on the Genesis bypass page, and then specifically the Genesis 1 bypass page for all the info that you could possibly need to know about that. Joel had a question about his JVC Xi. He wanted to know if after putting in the triple bypass, would composite video work? And no. Generally speaking, the way that I recommend most installations, there's a few exceptions, but most installations, and especially Genesis 1, is you lift the RGB pins off of the motherboard to completely remove any chance of interference whatsoever. There are a few exceptions where you could leave the pins down and cut traces or remove surface mount components and tap in the location that those components were at. There's a bunch of little tips and tricks, but the bottom line is you're removing the rest of the path of the RGB signals in almost every occasion. Leon found a version of the Genesis 3 where you could leave it in and only lift the RGB outputs of the CXA encoder, so you could even still have composite video. But that's one revision of the Genesis 3. So I think anybody installing the triple bypass should know that it will give you the best audio and video quality, but you're going to have to lose composite video as a result. There's other ways we could figure out how to put it back if it's super important for you. There's different ways that we could do it. I don't ever recommend running composite and RGB at the same time from those systems. But overall, I would just really plan on always lifting RGB and not having composite video, which is unfortunate. But I mean, if you're already using RGB or component via HD Retrovision, I mean, you wouldn't want to go back to composite anyway. Last week we talked a little bit about the new SCART to component video or VGA to component video converters that were sold on the LinuxBot 3000 eBay page. RetroTech posted a video. I asked that he post a link for anybody that's interested, and he did, so please check that out if you're interested to see how it would work. And I plan on doing a more in-depth, like hook it up to a scope and make sure it's safe type of review, because no disrespect whatsoever to your review. I thought it was good. It just, I really like to go deep into these things now, because things can seem to work properly and have other things going around in the background. So I might take you up on borrowing your prototype. I might just try to get brand new ones to see the most current revisions of it. And of course, I'm also going to be reviewing the RetroTink SCART to component, which I have had a chance to at least use, and it worked perfect. So, but once again, I haven't hooked it up to a scope. It seems to work perfect. So with stuff like this, I like to err on the side of caution, and not, even if it's from a trusted designer, I like to not say anything until I've put it on a scope and make sure it's safe for people to use on their equipment. I can't imagine it wouldn't be, but hey, whatever. I like to be cautious. So I guess if anybody wants an overview of it, please check out RetroTech's video. Jason Jackson wanted to know if I'd seen the announcement from Intel about adding integer scaling to future chipsets. And I did see it. I hadn't quite talked about it on the roundup yet, because at least at the moment, I think it's a little bit more relevant to just general PC use than anything else. But to put it into perspective, when you take something like you put a 1080p signal into a 4K monitor, it's the same exact issue as when you try to stretch retro. If you're typing on text, it very often gets soft and blurry, whereas integer scaling might actually work better. And I think a perfect example of this is the ZSWorks monitor, because when I put 1080p into it, it was razor sharp 1080p. You know, all the text was perfect, and I really think it's an awesome addition. I just didn't really talk about it on the roundup yet, because I want to put it into context and maybe do a video on it when it's released. Although I try to stay away from mainstream clickbaity videos, but maybe I'll put my spin on it and show how it really is relevant to different things. But as far as retro gaming, I'm not really sure how much that's going to be a help for us at the moment, but I guess we'll find out, right? Jim Nardacia had a great question, and one that's one of the hardest to answer, because even if I explained this for an hour, which I won't, I promise, it's still at the end of the day something that you would need to decide for yourself. But at the moment, it seems like he has a consumer-grade Trinitron and some HD Retrovision cables, which means you probably have component inputs on that. And he's looking to upgrade his whole setup, eventually get a PVM, or I guess possibly even an upscaler or something like that. So his question is, do you have any general advice on how best to start heading in that direction without dropping several $100s at once? So there's two ways to answer this. You said you already own HD Retrovision cables, and then you said maybe you're thinking of starting with one or two SCART cables and then moving over that way. So what I would normally recommend for people, if they're in the same situation as yours, and if they don't live in Europe, so there's no SCART inputs on the TV, deciding between going with HD Retrovision and RGB cables is a giant pain. So let me just paint both scenarios so that you'll realize why. And clearly, I mean no disrespect to HD Retrovision, but your scenario is a very common one, and one that's I think is amazing. So you find yourself a CRT, holy crap, it also has component video inputs, you've already won, and now you take HD Retrovision Genesis cables, and now you have the Saturn adapter, so now you could have a couple of different consoles hooked up to component video with just some basic cable swapping. Maybe you have SNES with S-Video, if your TV has S-Video as well, and original NES and whatever else in composite. Maybe you get a 2600 up to RF or something like that. And that's an amazing way to start. And in fact, anybody looking to start a retro setup, even if it doesn't have component inputs, that's perfectly great way. And one of the many reasons why I love the HD Retrovision cables is if you bought all of them, you have all the adapters, and that's the path you want to go, using those on a PVM or an OSSC will get you identical quality to RGB. The absolute worst case scenario is you have to turn a couple of dials on the PVM because it's been calibrated for RGB. But we're not talking about like deep dive into calibration. I'm talking about like flip the brightness and contrast a couple of millimeters and you're good. So the scenario that you've started down is already an awesome one, and you could pick up the upcoming 8x2 G-Comp switch. So it's a component video switch that you could also feed composite video into as well, which is great because if you don't have time or money to upgrade like the original Nintendo, you could just use it that way. And that, I mean, you've got everything covered right there, and you could upgrade incrementally. You don't have to drop hundreds. However, HD Retrovision doesn't support every console. And you could always look into RGB modding a consumer-grade TV, which is dangerous and a pain, but if you know how to do it, or if you have a friend that knows how to do it, it's pretty freaking phenomenal. It's not as sharp, it's not as high of a line count as a PVM, but everything else is very close to it. It looks like an arcade monitor. So the other path that you could take is just start buying one RGB cable at a time, and then hooking it up to maybe a converter. So maybe, let's say you love the Jaguar or something. You pick up an RGB SCART cable for the Jaguar. You pick up a cheap, hopefully one of the new cheaper solutions we've found is good, but you find a SCART to component converter, and you could kind of add things up that way. The good news is you could very easily mix and match. So you could buy a couple of SCART cables and a couple of HD Retrovision cables, and if you have a ton of consoles, it probably would be a help. Buy a G-Comp switch and a G-SCART switch, and now you have 8 inputs of both, and you might be covered for everything. So actually, by using those HD Retrovision on Genesis and Super Nintendo, frees up some spots on your SCART switch, so now other things could go there. So, I mean, it's really, you have to decide which path you want to take. There's no wrong path to go by. There's nothing wrong with mixing and matching. It just, depending on your setup, some people really prefer to have everything all automated through one switch with you never pushing a button. You just turn a console on and that's it. So that's the only time where it would matter, is if you really just wanted an auto-switching dedicated setup. But hopefully I laid that out clear enough, and this is something I'm going to be going into a little bit more later on in the year, is trying to help people find the path they take with this stuff. But luckily, as long as you're using the HD Retrovision cables or RGB SCART cables from the trusted sellers, Retro Access, Retro Gaming cables, and more recently even Insurrection Industries have great cables. As long as you're using good RGB cables or the HD Retrovision cables, you've won. It's just choosing which path you want to go down to complete your setup is the complicated part. So good luck with that, and let me know if I could do anything else to help. Dave Sobel said he recently picked up an Extron Super Mosha at a very reasonable price. Yeah, that is lucky. Usually the prices are through the roof these days. He said, I have some pages about how to do it, but he wants to ask the question of why. What are the common reasons someone would want to downscale a video signal? Well, I'll tell you the one very important reason to me, at least, and the one reason I spent so much time researching downscalers, the one and only reason originally, was because if you wanted to use the Game Boy Player software, the only way to get 240p was run it in 480p mode and then use a downscaler to get it down to 240p. And then someone named Extrems came along and completely changed the game with the Game Boy interface software. I actually think he helped the Swiss team in doing the automatic launching of the Game Boy interface software into 240p first, but it was so close to the time where he released the Game Boy interface, I don't even talk about that anymore. Sorry, Extrems, I hope that doesn't piss you off. I just, that's the main reason that I wanted it, honestly, was only to play Game Boy Advance games in 240p. But in my paths of researching this stuff and trying to figure out what you could do with it, there were a few other reasons that I found that over the years have actually become pretty helpful. So let's say you have just a basic PC with no special video card. You could force 640 by 480 output, but not 240p. So throw that through the Mosha, and now you have a 240p output from a computer, which is great for emulation. It's awesome for things like AM2R or any kind of new old style game that you want to play. So even though all of the hours I dumped into that were really focused on the now obsolete Game Boy Player, I really did enjoy and appreciate being able to downscale a computer. And a few other people like to take modern consoles and put them down to 480p modes and then downscale those. So there was a big discussion about the shmups on Xbox 360, especially because you could just get the Xbox VGA cable to make it even easier. So that would be another great reason for it. You know, newer style game or older style games on newer consoles that you could run in 240p. But for me personally, I don't even own a downscaler anymore. Once the Game Boy interface software came out, it's all I needed. So, you know, that doesn't mean that you should be disappointed in your purchase, though. I just listed a few reasons for it. If I had still had my Super Emotia, I guarantee I would have used it a lot more for PC-related stuff. But you should be happy you have one, and unless, for whatever reason, unless you need to get rid of it, it's a tool that I feel you should just hold on to and keep, at least until the next best thing comes out for downscaling. But yeah, hopefully that was a good enough list of reasons on how you might be able to use it or apply it to your setup. Eric Hurley had a couple of questions. The first one I kind of have two answers to. So his question was, he currently doesn't own any FPGA-based consoles, but he's considering getting one. He's a big Sega fan and also a fan of Kevtris's work, so the Mega SG really appeals to him. But do you think it makes more sense to pick up something like a DE10 Nano, as it handles a bunch more systems and is constantly being worked on? He already has a Genesis with an OSSC, so this would be for a secondary living room setup. So there's two answers to this question. Kevtris, it will always be closed source. He kind of made that pretty clear. I have no problems with that at all. I like Kevin. He shares his info with people. He helps people out. So having a closed source product that he sells and supports through the company, perfect. So if you're looking to get into this, to tinker with consoles and to mess around with the FPGA solutions, to have dual output and to really just, if you're into tinkering, there's no question that you should get the Mister, because you can't tinker with a Kevtris console. But on the other side of that, I am a giant fan of Kevin's work, and you know, the Mega SG is really awesome, and I have a feeling he's going to continue to tweak that to get it as perfect as one could ever be. My experience with the Mister and the Genesis core has been totally positive, but at the moment it doesn't play real Genesis cartridges. So, you know, it's really back and forth as to, you have to decide which is more important to you. Buying an HDMI Genesis that's an amazingly good recreation of the original, or buying something that you're going to probably be constantly tinkering with, but you get that experience as well. So it's really whatever's up to you. And I also do want to remind you that a Genesis with an OSSC is a phenomenal solution that you should be very happy with, but no console that outputs analog video could ever possibly be as good as a digital-to-digital solution, because you're always going to have some kind of analog noise. And in the, you know, right now upscaling to 1080p, you can kind of notice it, but not really. But in the days coming where I'm sure there's going to be 4K upscalers at some point, any analog noise is going to start to be a lot more pronounced. So I'm happy that you're looking to get a more digital solution if you plan on gaming on flat screens. But which one to buy really just depends on what's more important to you. Having something really focused on the Sega experience, you know, the Genesis 16-bit, or having something that's focused on everything that just so happens to have a very good Genesis core. And Eric's last question is, what do I think the best version of the Nintendo DS is? And I guess, you know, there's a few things to consider. Screens, features, and the actual fit and how it feels when you play it. So for me personally, I just don't like the feel of the original one. No offense, no disrespect, it's not my thing. Functionality-wise, the DSi has extra software you can't play on the others. Whereas the other DS models can play Game Boy Advance games, so maybe that's important to you. I don't know if one has a better screen than the other, and that's something I'd like a lot more info on. And I think people have done pretty in-depth comparisons, but I'm not sure if there's one definitive one that I could recommend. So if anybody knows if there's a specific model that has the best screen, please let me know. And I guess the other question I would have is, would the speed bump of the DSi really be enough to see a real-world difference in other DS games? Which I'm not 100% sure about either. So if anybody knows that info, please let us know. Well, that's it for this week. It is about 1,000,000 degrees in here now, so I'm going to crank up the AC and go pack for my trip. And also, I don't think I'll have any time to do any kind of meetup or anything while I'm out in LA. Like every minute of my trip is planned around family stuff, and I would have liked to have had more time, but I just don't have that much more time to spend out there. So I'll let everybody know. I will be in San Diego as well for one night. I don't think I'm going to have time for anything, but if I do, I'll tweet about it. And I know not everybody likes to deal with social media. I certainly don't most of the time. So I know it's a pain to say go up on Twitter. So I will also make sure to post on every support platform if I have time to do anything. But I don't think I will. And it stinks because I love meeting all of you. So hopefully I could figure something out. But if not, I will be coming back to the West Coast this fall. More on that later. But I wish I had more time to schedule for this. I just honestly don't. But anyway, as always, thank you so much to everybody that participates in these. I really enjoy doing them. And for anybody new to the weekly Q&As, any question at all that you have, just post in the latest Q&A post on whatever support platform you've signed up for. I check them all. I just can't really check any of the older ones. And also, I may have missed your question. Something may have accidentally gotten deleted. So whatever question you have or something that you need to re-ask, just find the latest Q&A in the support platform and post it there. And while these do go live to the public about a month later, this is my direct thank you to all of you for the support. So I turn the comments off and really make this focused on the supporter experience. So as always, thank you all so much, and I will see you next week.